You're very welcome here to Life Talk Live on Dublin South FM. That's 93.9 FM. You're here with Melanie Hoskin, and I want to give a shout out last week to the group that we were talking to. They were a non-profit organisation called Humans 2, and they're doing Trojan work out there on the streets with homeless people, supporting them and helping them in any way they can. The podcast for that is actually out. It's on my own site, melaniehoskin.ie, and you can also find it here on dublinsouthfm.ie. Moving on to today's subject matter, I'm talking here with Lisa O'Hara, who is a psychotherapist at Mind and Body Works. They're based in Wicklow Street in Dublin here and also in Donnybrook. And you're very welcome here today. Lisa.
Good afternoon, Mel.
We're talking today about grief and understanding grief. And this is an area that you're quite knowledgeable in, right?
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
We commonly equate grief to the loss of somebody that we love or that we valued. Grief is merely a response to loss, right?
That's right.
And not necessarily somebody connected to us, but rather something we've lost as well. It can be something or someone. So it could be a job, or it could be...
Yeah, it could be anything. And you're right, because it is a normal response to loss of something or someone or somewhere that we are emotionally connected to. And I suppose really has been a move away from the notion that we just simply let go, that the work of grief is just letting go. And I think nowadays we sort of are moving towards the recognition of a potentially healthy role of maintaining continuing bonds with the lost person if they've died or whatever it is, and to make sense and find meaning again. So it's not that we never talk about that person ever again or anything like that. You know, you'll often hear people saying, oh God, your dad would love that if he was here. So in a way we continue the bond. They're alive inside us. And I guess really just to come back to what you were saying there, you know, C.S. Lewis, he wrote a book called A Grief Observed. He did describe in it that grief is the price we pay for love.
And I think that always kind of resonated with me as well. It makes so much sense that grief it's kind of like you know, the Garth Brooks song The Dance, you know. If he hadn't have experienced the dance, he wouldn't have experienced anything with that person. C.S. Lewis, he did write the book. Would you recommend that book for people to read, or is it a bit heavy?
Well, I'll tell you, anybody who's actually gone through it will often see, I mean, he wrote the book after his wife died, and he loved his wife very dearly, but he really writes about his very internal experience of her and the searching for her and the fantasising about her and the low feeling, the real depressed, like what was he going to do without her? So in some ways he actually describes such his own very, very personal experience of the loss of something he loved and treasured deeply. So it's a lovely book to read. It can be a heavy read if that's not where you're at, but it can help you to really understand what the experience of grief is about.
And also in terms of personal growth,
yes,
grief can also create a platform for that for people. Right?
It can, but often it's about we only get it a lot after, you know, retrospectively we look back and we sort of think, oh my God, I never thought I'd be able to go through that. Or, you know, anyone who has had somebody in their life who, you know, who was dying, and you know, that really the amount it takes out of you, you'd never know you were even capable of it. So, do you know, it sort of really, it shows you what your own resilience to be able to survive something like that. And we also look at it in terms of, you know, how we adapt and adjust to loss after it's happened. But as I said, we often don't know that until a bit further down the line. Yeah.
What are the signs of grief, Lisa?
Well, you see, now that's really...
It's quite broad there.
I know it is. I guess we really have to look at it again. We've got to look at it in different, from different perspectives. So there'll be an emotional the emotional experience of grief, which is, it's the feelings that we have about grief. And I know we're going to talk a bit more about that a bit further on. But a lot of times, we've got the sadness. We may have anger, confusion, forgetfulness. People often find that, they may have said they'll do something and then they forget to do it. They don't turn up at appointments. These are all really normal responses to grief. And then we have the physiological responses to grief, which can be, people sighing quite a lot, or maybe not being able to sleep, maybe poor appetite, maybe eating too much, maybe drinking too much, so it's just a change in appetite. And people often saying that they've got pains. They may have a lot of backache or feel very tired, very fatigued all the time. They wake up at, they say the classic grief hours, I think, are between 2 and 5. People wake up at those times going, oh my God, here I am awake again, and it's back again. And anybody who's lost somebody very close to them, in those few moments when they wake up, the world is okay, but just for a few seconds until reality comes in. It's almost like we've been anaesthetised just for those few seconds, and then we're thrown back into the grief once again. There's also a very spiritual side to grief, which is some people find a spiritual side and other people lose it. So you may have been you may have had a strong spiritual side or religious side to yourself, and then if something feels absolutely totally wrong, it shouldn't have happened, we might just question our own faith. And then other people find that faith gives them they draw great comfort in their faith. And I guess then the other side is there's also a social aspect to grief. So it might be that we may need others more around us because we just really need them as we're grieving and mourning. And for other people, they just can't engage and they'd sooner be on their own. But it's just how extraordinary the experience of grief is. It's very individual. There's no normal. Again, I know we're going to talk a bit about, what is normal, but just that it's just an extraordinary time.
Okay. Does the amount of time somebody suffers grief make a difference? You might have somebody that has no experience of loss, I suppose, and then something comes along, maybe, I don't know, mid-20s, 30s, and they're just blown out of the water with this. Or then you've got people who have lost maybe parents in childhood, and then you've got them might have lost a grandparent, and then another loss. Do you manage grief better the more times loss occurs?
Yeah, well, it's certainly, that's a very important factor to consider when we look at how people actually adjust and adapt to loss. And one of the things we will look at, particularly in therapy, is tell me about other losses that you've experienced. How did you cope with them then? And some people will say, well, I've never had anything seriously ever happen, and so their world is kind of completely turned upside down, and it may look like they have no coping strategies at all, but the reality of it is, we're always dealing with loss in some shape or form. When we move from childhood into adolescence into adulthood, they're all like losses that we experience in terms of our development. As we move through life, we change from one job to another, and things happen. So we do have coping strategies. I think when loss has happened or is happening, an individual, I think, simply put, they will just appraise the situation and engage in their own way of coping. It's a complex mechanism. There may be a couple of different ways of coping. You might be looking at it in terms of the emotions and dealing with the emotional consequences, or you might be a person who's quite problem focused and you're trying to eliminate the stress, because that's what loss is. It's a huge stress, and it's about trying to eliminate the stress through maybe behaviour. So what can I do to get over this? That's really the way problem focused coper will be. And also the current thinking, or the most recent thinking on how we deal with grief includes a sort of this almost like confronting the loss in terms of the pain and the emotional impact of it and then avoiding it. And that in itself, I think, to give an example of it, might be, you've been absolutely devastated by this, and then you've gone out, somebody's invited you to go out and you actually had a good night. And then you're going, oh my God, well, that's a kind of an avoidance, you're moving away from it. But what can happen is you think, oh my God, how can I enjoy things when I've been through this and it's awful, and so you're thrown back into the loss again. But I guess really it's about how we go back and forward in the confronting it and moving away from it. And really it's by this sort of, they call it an oscillating process. The research now tells us that we think it's just down to the person's own resilience, their desire to survive the loss. So, very normal. And, we'll often, even when people die, even a little bit further down the road, you might have a day where you didn't think about the person for a few hours, and then you feel guilty because are you forgetting them? That's not it at all. You haven't forgotten about them. It's just you are adapting and adjusting in quite a healthy way.
Yeah.
By maybe just, moving away from it for a little bit.
Yeah, and giving yourself permission to do that, I guess.
Yeah.
But I suppose it's a melting pot of emotions, really, isn't it? That you flicker from one to the other.
Yes, that's right.
And it can kind of catch you by surprise as well, because nothing is kind of linear. Everything is kind of messed up with each other.
Yes.
In terms of emotions.
Yeah. And the emotions aren't... I know there is a... there's a very popular model out there, Kubler-Ross, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She developed a model in the late 60s, and it really helped us to understand what some of the feelings that underlie or come in under the grief umbrella. And, she developed these 5 stages, denial, anger, bargaining, depression and acceptance. And of course, maybe acceptance isn't about saying it's ever okay that it happened, but just that there's a reality to this and we accept that the loss is a reality. So I guess there's another way of looking at it as well, which is really we need to, accept the pain of the loss. We also need to process the pain and adjust to the world without the person. And that might be, really our whole assumptions for living can emerge, because we're, if a child dies before us, that's never going to fall into the normal. I mean, so your assumptions about, I'm the parent and, my child has died, how could that be right? So you can't make an assumption. So do you know what I mean? It's like all that is, it's kind of really up for it's really up there for maybe looking at again and, making new assumptions that actually loss can happen to anyone. Life is very fragile, very precious. And really it's about as well finding an enduring connection to the deceased person if it's death, and finding a way to remember them. And often you find people, they do things like, they get involved in charity cycles and runs in memory of somebody who meant something to them, and that's very important. It's a very important ritual, and it can be very helpful for helping them to deal with that loss.
And I think that the finality of death in particular leaves you feeling out of control, leaves you feeling that you're on a conveyor belt of grief that is determined by, say, a set of criteria, say the stages of grief. And that's kind of always been ingrained in us, there's stages of grief and you have to go through them, and they might come at different times. And
yes.
Sometimes I think that the process is a personal journey.
It is. I'm really glad you brought that up, because the most important thing to remember is that it is such an individual experience, and not everybody goes through, the denial. Not everybody goes through anger, bargaining, depression or grief. Not everyone does. And so, it's about just acknowledging that it's not linear. You don't go through it, as you said earlier on, it's a bit messy. You can come out of it, go on to another, say, okay, I'm okay now today. Does that mean I've moved on from it? Only to be thrown back into it maybe 3-4 days later and feeling, oh no, here I am, I'm back here again, back in the loss. Will I ever get over it? So that's a very normal thing. So it's just really just knowing that, we have our own sort of way of, grief is its own way of working its way through us, and we have our own way of dealing with it. It's very unique, and there's nothing abnormal about that. But also, it depends on a lot of things as well, just in terms of, the type of loss. Our relationship with the bereaved person. Some people don't feel it at all. They go, and I feel really guilty because I'm not feeling sad. But maybe it has something to do with the relationship. Maybe you did your grief when they were dying, rather than when they had died. It's the circumstances around the loss. Was it sudden or was it anticipated? Your prior experiences, as we talked about earlier, how you dealt with loss before, our own personality, other things like our age, our gender, our beliefs, our cultural beliefs, our spiritual beliefs, and other personal variables like our health and lifestyle habits. They all help us to understand how we deal with that.
Yeah. Okay, we're just going to go into a little break and we'll be back in a few minutes.
Dublin South FM.
Hello, you're very welcome back. Here you're on Life Talk Live with Melanie Hoskin, and we're here talking to Lisa O'Hara. Hello, Lisa. Hi. We're actually talking about grief and understanding grief. Lisa, do men and women, do they grieve differently? Is there different coping mechanisms there, or?
Well, one of the major reasons for the differences in how men and women grieve has probably got to do with the evolution of cultural expectations. So it'll be how our society defines masculine and feminine. And it probably has a lot to do with the evolution of roles. But I suppose if we look at masculine characteristics, or how we might often see men, not every man, when he's grieving, is he may be sort of seeing himself as sort of the problem solver, and he taking charge and wanting to be strong for others. You may not see that many feelings. He might be very much more thinking about the thinking rather than the feelings, and maybe not wanting to do feelings all that much. May come across as quite, independent and self-contained, and would maybe want to return to work very quickly. So that would be, for maybe a woman looking at that, she might be thinking he's not grieving at all. But he is. I suppose these expectations of what a man is can often cause a major block to how they can express grief. So, really when a man cries or is feeling powerless and vulnerable, it can be very hard on him. So he may be set himself up to move away from it rather than confront it. And so he may not be able to do the work of mourning his loss. So I guess when he's expecting himself to be a strong rock and protector and the problem solver of his family, he'll rarely be offered any other way of grieving other than being strong, capable or in control. I think he may see that his dependency, if he needs to talk to somebody, as a weakness. I suppose when you think about it, you think about that, you're a big boy now, boys don't cry, and he's really expecting himself to sort of really kind of to step up and step away from sort of, his own vulnerability and his own loss. And you may sort of see that a bit further down the line, he may feel very low in himself. And, I suppose it's very important to say that, sometimes we see men repartnering, and they certainly tend to do it more than women do. When they repartner, they find someone new, what might be seen as very soon after the loss. But, we forget that for men, often their partner is their confidant, and they've lost that, whereas women are much more relational. They may have a group of friends, they talk, they can find it easy. So for a man, it's a different kind of loss. And so they would be keen to obviously bridge that gap as soon as possible. Doesn't mean they didn't care for their partner or love them deeply. It's just, they really feel they're on their own bit. But women, on the other hand, do well talking about their feelings and sharing their feelings, and they don't mind if things aren't, if normal routines aren't resumed for a while. If she's a very what's called an intuitive coper, which is I really need to just. I'm in pain and I need to talk about it. Yeah. Whereas he might be totally different. Now, I suppose I need to make it very clear, not all men and not all women are like that. I mean, you may often see that the intuitive and the instrumental coping, the intuitive being very feminine way of coping, which is sharing the feelings, talking about feelings, and the intuitive or the instrumental type, which is, it's very cognitive, very thinking, very... let's do something or whatever, that really there's a place for both.
Yeah. And also, when somebody assumes that role, perhaps they feel, especially if there are children involved or people that they feel are more vulnerable than them, that they have to protect them. And that leaves them then in a spot where they kind of feel, I actually can't deviate from this role because then I'll fall apart. They
don't have a choice until further down the line. And we do see, I mean, on this spectrum of, the kind of what are called the adaptive styles. So we're on this spectrum where, there's the doing and the thinking, and then there's the feeling, and we're kind of a bit of a mishmash of both, really. We're usually a blend. We're somewhere along that spectrum. And, I think most people who've been involved in funeral arrangements will tell you it's a very busy time. May not be time. You may kind of surrender to the crying, and then you have to get on with making arrangements. So you're kind of in and out of the feeling and the doing. And, anybody who's children will tell you they have to get up. They've got to get them up in the morning. They can't just be lying around feeling sorry for themselves. So the actual emotional bit of it may not come till a little bit further on, or it comes in tiny little drips. But that's just the nature of it. Life happens as well. And then, of course, you have the person, a dissonant type, which is somebody who is expected to go counter their own natural style, which might be a man who feels that he needs to be more manly, and yet he's feeling very tearful and very, really, really deeply, deeply upset, and he can't show it. Or the man who just doesn't cry and feels there's something wrong with him because he really did love his wife. So there's a kind of a mixed-uppy bit inside, and they will often be people that we might see in therapy a little bit further down the line.
I don't know if you've heard of an expression called "in the doldrums."
Yeah.
My brother actually told me about that expression. It's when sailors they're caught out at sea. Mostly, I think it applies to sailboats, and the sails are up, but there's no wind. And they could wait there for days for the wind to come up so that the boat can actually move, and they get stuck in the doldrums. That's where that originated from.
Right.
And I think so they'd be there for days and they'd start to get depressed and they'd start to get lonely and they'd start to think about things, and people at home, they feel very isolated. Is there going to be a breeze coming along? Am I going to come out of there? And it's kind of similar, it's a good phrase. Like, I think there's an element of grief that you have to travel alone, and it's like wading in the doldrums for that pick me up that will take you on further on your journey. Is there a time, and is it good to just sit with your loss and feel the pain?
There is definitely a time element to this. When we're doing, grief work as such, and as we're mourning, we can be mourning all our lives because that person may be gone now, and they're not coming back. So they're always not coming back. So we could be 10 years down the line and we still get caught up with the, oh my God, those very strong, loss feelings, and we're feeling it all over again. We don't do grief all in one go because we'd go mad. It's too intense and it's too painful. However, it does take time. It never goes fast enough. And, people will often say 2 years down the line, they'll often, this first anniversary is very important because it's a year of firsts.
Yeah.
But, to normalise it as well, a lot of people, the second anniversary is harder. And they're surprised at it because maybe it again has to do with expectations. I thought I'd be over this by now. But there is certainly a sort of there is a mourning period, and acute grief will be felt for several weeks or several months, and that is entirely normal. What happens though is after a period, and I don't want to get too much into the time, that actually we start to, psychologically adjust. But we have to really expect that symptoms could be very, very intense for at least 6 months.
Okay.
Very normal, very normal. But 6 months is a long time when you're in pain. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah.
And nobody can know our own pain like we know it ourselves. It's ours.
Especially when you revert back to feelings, and I mean there's so much to deal with in that time, and so much pain around that depending on the relationship or the loss that you're experiencing. What can people do to help somebody that's grieving? Because often people kind of stay away, or they kind of feel, well, I'm not going to bring it up now, I'm not going to upset him or her, or what can people do?
Well, I think, again, it depends on the person, but it's often easier if you've been through it yourself to maybe approach the person and, it's the simple, how are you? And if the person just says, fine, sometimes they don't want to talk about it, don't push it because you think they should. Other people really want to talk about it, and I think it can be very hard as the listener to not rush in with solutions, to actually just sit and just listen, because I did hear an expression I think is very good for when somebody is grieving: say nothing unless what you say is an improvement on silence.
Okay.
Yeah.
I suppose empathic listening, when you're not surface listening and you're thinking up something to say, how am I going to make this better?
That's it.
Just to let people talk and just to let the words come out and go where they go.
You might have an urge to actually say something, but try not to. I mean, the person does need, part of them processing the grief is, for a lot of people, can be about talking about it, and it's good to have that space where nobody's going to judge you or try to push you on or make it all better. This is just something you're going through. You will move on from it. People do. But part of it is, you see the Jewish community, they have 7 days where they sit and they talk about that person incessantly for 7 days. And it's part of how they ritualise the loss. It's a very important ritual for them. And it works. So the other thing is, really, we often think we'll have a sort of an idea of how a person should do grief, and it's very often based on how we do it ourselves. Yeah. But just to kind of maybe respect that people are very different, respect and gentleness, very important. And how can I help you? And people will tell you. They might just say, could you pick up my kids from school, or could you make something for us to eat, or I just can't cook today. So if you can help them that way, but rather, ask them, how can I help you? How can I support you? Say nothing unless whatever you say is an improvement on silence. And just be as compassionate and as kind as you can.
And how about anger in grief? When the anger is probably one of those stages that people find most difficult to respond to or to facilitate, I guess. What's the best way to respond to somebody who is at that stage?
You've got to look at anger. I mean, anger is an expression. If somebody's telling you they're really, really angry, well, that's just a feeling. Something's the matter. Something's has happened, and anger can often be a very, one of those responses to an injustice. So it's just normal. I think, it's the power of what the anger can do.
Yeah.
So if anger becomes very abusive, it's just being mindful of that, that everybody's safe. So that's the dangerous when anger is out of control. But in and of itself, anger is just another emotion.
And I suppose for people to know, that it's okay to be angry.
Oh, it is, yeah. Yeah, very normal. This is one of those very normal feelings. And anger often covers over sadness. If sadness isn't somehow a feeling that is easily tolerated internally, you may just see anger, but it's usually one is covering over one is covering over the other, and the same with sadness. Sometimes it's the absence of anger; it's just covering it.
So the important thing would be to acknowledge what somebody is saying to you, and not to say, "Oh, that's a bit odd," or "This is a bit."
No,
to listen to listen to what they
and
say,
to acknowledge them and say, you seem like you're really angry about this. I can hear you.
Is there are there signs that somebody isn't coping well with their grief? Maybe where somebody might want to say to them, maybe you need to see somebody at this stage, or are there any signs that we could look for? Prolonged grief, for example, or can you really put a time limit on grief?
Well, I'm not sure you can really, but if somebody seems very much in the loss, in the feelings, and it's going on for a long time, and they're really not getting up and doing their everyday, on some level they're kind of going into they're sort of back to, I think most people ultimately adapt well to bereavement, and they typically regain their psychological equilibrium after an acute grieving period. And an acute grieving period is normal. It's very normal. It's a normal response to loss. It doesn't mean that the grief is done. It just means that it's better integrated. Although they'll frequently continue to miss the loved one, But I think really if you're concerned about it, if you're concerned about your own, go and talk to your doctor. Maybe go and see a counsellor who's really well familiar with working with grief. Because there may be, for about 10% of the population, you're looking at maybe a prolonged grief disorder, or what's called complicated grief. But it's very rare, very rare. Yeah.
But there is support there for that
is,
if somebody finds themselves experiencing or, staying in the denial stage too long, or the anger stage is too long, just living there.
Yeah, counselling actually can be very helpful. But really just to say that, for most of us, because we're feeling pain, because we're there 6 months and we're going, is there something wrong with me? There is nothing wrong with you. You may not need any extra help at all. For a very small few people, they do need some help. And it's just really to support them if they're a bit stuck.
Yeah. So it's called a grieving process for a reason, because it is a process.
That's it
is a journey.
Yeah.
Okay, we're just going to go into another break. Thanks a million, Lisa.
Dublin South FM.
Hello, you're very welcome back here to Live Talk Live, here with Melanie Hoskin. You're on Dublin South FM. Today we're talking about understanding grief. We're having a discussion around grief here with Lisa O'Hara.
Hi, Mel.
Welcome back, Lisa. We were talking before the break about signs that somebody isn't coping well, and you were talking about that for a little bit. What I want to go into here is children and loss, in particular death. Do children need to be guided through that grieving process? Because surely they have no concept of how that works, or even a natural process. I mean, if you leave that down to a child, it'll just go where their imagination takes them. And, do they have a grieving style that we need to be aware of, or that we can support them in?
Yeah, what we tend to do is we tend to look at it through the lens of age, age, dependent on what their needs are and what their behaviours might be. So you're right. Children under the age of about 7 or 8 have no sense of death being final. They always think the person is coming back to them. And so I think we kind of fudge it and we make it even more confusing when we say, oh, Grandma's an angel in heaven now, or you know, they're up there in heaven, or no, they're still here every day. They're not still here every day. They're dead. And it's a very protective thing we do. Death seems such a kind of such a harsh thing, and I suppose what we're trying to do is protect our children from distress. And you'll often see, you know, even people not bringing their children to funerals to see the dead person. But how is a child supposed to integrate that loss if they can't see the person is dead? Stay with them.
Yeah,
bring them up to see the person if they want to. Maybe they don't want to. But to bring them up and show them, stay with them, and just see how they are with it. Children are tough. They're often very resilient, and we underestimate their own resilience. And they may get very distressed and start crying. And then what they need is your reassurance and your comfort. But I think the important thing is that they do not realise, really under about the age of 8, they don't realise it's final. And they always think the person's coming back. So you need to use very final words like, no, they're not coming back. And let the upset come up and then reassure them and stay with them until the upset drops away.
So deal with the pain rather than go into denial with your children or lead them down a path of...
Yeah, because you know yourself as an adult, like if you're presented with confusion, if you're feeling confused about something or unsure about something, you know, that really sets up huge stress in ourselves. It'll do the same for children. So what you need to do is, you know, between the ages of 2 and 4, children will often feel abandoned, and they feel that the lost person is coming back, and the grief may be very intense. You might see bedwetting, general irritability and some confusion. So really you need to have short and very honest interactions with them from the ages of 4 to 7. Again, there may be no sense of finality about it and might be seen as death being reversible. But children at that age often think, oh my God, I was really mean to Granny or Dad or whoever, and I wish they were dead, and now they're dead, and they might feel very responsible. So they do need reassurance that actually it really wasn't their fault. They may have an awful lot of questions, very persistent in the questions. 7 to 11s would be the same. They're looking for very specific detail, and 7 to 11s, the older children, then can become very concerned about how other people are responding. There may be problems in school, there may be academic problems, some academic problems, maybe withdrawing from friends, acting out, sleeping and eating disturbances. So, you know, it's just answer the questions, just encourage them to talk about their feelings, give them options and allow for choices. You know, so it's really about, you know, it's about sort of staying with your child and seeing where they're at. And anybody in a family will tell you where there's a couple of children, they're all very different, their needs are very different. So you need to just, you know, go to the level your child is at. They see the world through different eyes anyway, but they're a lot more resilient than you give them credit for.
Okay. And what about the as you call them, the in-betweeners, the adolescents? The
adolescents, well,
between childhood and adulthood.
Yeah, well, they need to be very included and consulted and involved with what's going on. They do need information, reassurance and support, and they often have a strong sense of loss and the meaning for it as a family. So if the dad dies and you're the eldest son and the mother says, well, you're the man at the house now, that's a huge pressure on that teenager, and their childhood is gone then. Parents often think, oh, we need to get them into counselling, and it's not to say that's not a place ways for them, but they'll often feel like there's something the matter with them.
Yeah.
They're just they're grieving. But I think counselling can work if it's very, if it's done on a time limited basis. And usually what I would say to parents when I was working with teenagers is just to say, invite them to come in for one. They don't have to come anymore.
Yeah,
they can decide themselves.
Yeah.
They do need the surviving parent to be quite strong.
Right.
They're experiencing their own loss, but they do need that parent to be strong.
I just want to kind of come away from that for the last couple of minutes of the show, and I want to talk about separation, divorce, in terms of how children cope with that, which is a grief as well. But you've got, obviously, you haven't got a bereavement in terms of somebody has died, but you do have a huge life change in terms of somebody's gone. How do children, navigate that, or what is the best way for parents to, firstly, well, I suppose to acknowledge my child is probably going to go into a grieving process here, or some sort of how do I support them in that?
Well, again, you come back to the same kind of support as when somebody has died. I mean, they do need information. It needs to be age relevant. They don't need to get tied up in your problems. We're leaving because daddy decided to. So they get very caught up in that. That can be very confusing. Children often feel under pressure to take sides, and that's when we have this concept now of parental alienation syndrome, where one parent is really frozen out by the family. It's very unfair. Children are very powerless in all this. They've had no input into the decision making. They can often feel like they're to blame. If I was a bold, one girl said to me years ago, she said, I was bold when I was 5 and I thought that was the reason my dad left. So they need to know that they're not to blame and that they're loved. They need very clear information. This is what's going to happen, at least for the short to medium term, and to be very consistent in how you are. Do not bring them into the adult problems, and see if there's somebody who's close to you that the children trust, that they can rely on. Because you too will be going through your own loss.
And people kind of forget that when they separate, children have witnessed or probably witnessed a lot coming up to that separation. And I suppose even if they haven't witnessed it, it's probably even worse because they're not expecting something. And they have to be, again, first and foremost, guided through the grieving process of this separation, and then reassured that everything's going to be okay. They still have 2 parents that love them, and it's going to be worked out. And where there has been high conflict prior to the separation, as you said, those children will often feel relief. Oh, thank God, this is over. Whereas the children who it seems to have come out of nowhere, they'll just get a terrible fright. And just they can't make sense of it at all. So that's why they do need people to be in their lives, paying attention to how they are. They may not have a language, and so that's what the acting out the behaviour comes from. It's when they don't have the language to tell you that they're struggling. And I suppose that's where parents can take the lead there and lead children forward and let them know we're moving forward with this.
And handovers, handovers are become very important, because it's that moment where you and your partner meet each other again. And if the child is seeing that, do you know what? Mel, it's really asking you to be the most adult you've ever been in your life. And it's the time when you just feel like the most childlike, vulnerable, hurt, maybe.
And that's just it. If people could hold on to that, this is where you really have to kind of pull up your socks and be an adult, and kind of forget about the emotions coming in, and be the adult. Look, we've run out of time, Lisa. Could have done another show with you. Should have booked you for 2 hours. Listen, I want to thank Peter on sound, and again thank Lisa O'Hara, and thanks to the listeners for listening, and we'll talk to you next week. Bye.